I'm the CEO at the Churchill Club, and our program this evening is called A World Awash in Data, Decisions, Risks, and Opportunities. The rate of change in volume, variety, and ubiquity of data collected globally is arguably impossible to measure, let alone understand. Just in its infancy, it has already enabled previously unimaginable advances, both good and bad, from science, commerce, and technology to cybercrime, fraud, and privacy breach. And as this data tsunami continues, governments and businesses struggle to react to a rapidly changing world that continues to surprise. Finding the right path usually starts with asking the right questions. And with us to discuss what this means to them are two industry leaders and distinguished thinkers, Anthony Scriffignano, Senior Vice President and Chief Data Scientist at Dun & Bradstreet, and Gordon Crovitz, Global Chief Executive, Entrepreneur, and Board Member. We thank Dun & Bradstreet for their partnership in making this program possible, especially Barbara Robinson, Ilya Mazin, and Deborah Chin. A few words about Churchill Club, a nonprofit business and technology organization that ignites conversations about what's new, next, and not widely discussed, in effort to contribute actionable new insights to the global innovation community. And we value future-oriented discussions that transcend brand to explore opportunities and critical issues that might lead to new actions around innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. We are member-supported, and we do invite you to join us. If you're tweeting tonight, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you will find other Twitter information in your bulletins. And with that, please now give your warmest welcome to our speakers, Anthony Scriffignano and Gordon Crovitz.
So this is really exciting for me. Anthony and I have known each other for a while, and we've had conversations on some of these topics, usually just a meal between the two of us. Now we're having a meal with all these people present, which I think is fantastic, and we thank the Churchill Club for having us. So Anthony, you are a chief data scientist. That means that you're supposed to be a font of wisdom and knowledge, or at least potential knowledge. So one thing we want to talk about tonight is what knowledge does data currently make available to us? What are the barriers to using data to create knowledge? And over time, looking forward, what kinds of things might we learn from data that we haven't yet learned? So those are some of the themes. Let me start with an easy question. Anthony, what is big data and how is it different from just smart data?
Well, it's not such an easy question. There's lots of different answers to that. I'm sure if we polled the audience, we would get quite a variety, and that's part of the problem. So the traditional way of thinking about big data is these V's: volume, veracity, variety, value. The characteristics of data, a lot of people think of big data as just a lot of data. We've had lots of data since they had computers and places to store data. The difference is when all of those V's overwhelm the best efforts to deal with them, not because you didn't buy the right technology or you don't have the right people, but even with all of that, you're being overwhelmed by the situation. The MH370 plane that's missing right now, there's, I think, 7 arcs that the data says the plane is in one of these 7 arcs. Well, that means 6/7 of that data is wrong, right? 14% of that data is pointing to where the plane is. That's what a big data problem feels like.
So you've referred to one of these problems as the Red Queen problem, I think from Alice in Wonderland. So Alice in Wonderland was written, right, by a mathematician.
Yeah.
But before the era of really big data.
Yeah.
So tell us about the Red Queen problem and how having a lot of data makes us sometimes think that we can get to an answer with the data and not always.
So the Red Queen problem is a computer science term, and it comes from the book Alice in Wonderland. The guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland was an author, a mathematician, a priest, very interesting guy. He's what we would call a polymath. And in Alice in Wonderland, or Through the Looking Glass, or whatever it's called, there's various titles for it, there's a scene which is intended to be allegorical. And it's Alice is sitting at the tea party with the Mad Hatter and all these characters and the March Hare, and the Red Queen is at the head of the table. And Alice says to the Red Queen, this is a really strange place where I've been running and running and running as fast as I can and I don't seem to be getting anywhere. And the Red Queen says that's exactly the kind of place this is. You need to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are. So, you know, a Red Queen problem is exactly that. It's where there's no guarantee that turning the crank faster, putting more resources toward the problem, doing what you're doing at a higher scale doesn't necessarily guarantee you'll make any progress towards the problem. And the solution to a Red Queen problem is to do something orthogonal, something completely different, and it doesn't necessarily mean you can abandon turning that crank. So that's the rub there. And we're living in a Red Queen problem. Almost all the problems that face data science today, how do we get longer lasting cell phone batteries? Well, let's make them denser and higher milliamp hours. Well, that'll work for a while, but we're not going to solve that problem until somebody says, well, why didn't you put peanut butter in it? There's something that we haven't thought about yet.
The peanut butter answer.
Exactly.
Wow,
it's
is
a sticky
from Tesla
thing.
here? Because this could really be a
it's a sticky
fantastic
situation.
answer. There's another concept that I find fascinating that I think you coined called the dark room problem. So as I understand it, imagine if we had all the experts on batteries in one room. And you asked that, so you had all the experts there, you would think that that would be a great way to get the right answer, but it's not. Explain that to us.
So the idea behind a dark room problem is if you take all the experts on any subject and all the literature and all the knowledge on that subject and you bring it into one place and you lock the door, that is the best place to go and get an answer on that subject, and it is. It is absolutely the best place. But over time, that subject evolves. And the people in the room can only learn about that subject from the imperfect interpretation of people outside the room. So they come and they yell through the door, or they pass notes under the door. There are other problems that are similar to this one. Over time, that room becomes the worst possible place to go to get information on that subject because things have changed so much outside the room. And this is, the analog here is obviously data sovereignty. You know, there's places in the world, and this is one of them, where we try to lock the door and keep certain types of information in a silo, and you can do that, but you have to realize that you're creating a dark room. And the secret is to allow access through the windows, to have ways for information to pass in and out. It doesn't mean that you don't keep the information in that room or the experts in that room, metaphorically, but what it means is that you have discussed how information would flow in and out through the windows. And you know, how do we deal with, think about like the Snowden incident is a perfect example. There was a lot of reaction all over the world, let's write laws to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Are you going to prevent someone who's willing to break the law and has access from breaking the law? No, you're not. So it's not logical that you're going to completely solve that problem. You might help with legislation, but you've got to address the fundamental behavior of what's going in and out of the window.
Just on this one, do regulators understand the risk of the dark room problem?
In my experience, I've spoken with a lot of the regulators on this topic around the world, and some do and some don't. We have to realize that the role of a regulator is to regulate, right? So someone has given them the mandate to write some regulation about, you know, water bottles. So they go and write regulations about water bottles. They don't necessarily consider the ecosystem around that, because that's not their mandate. So our job as purveyors and producers and curators of data is to make sure that the unintended impact of things like this is well understood. What's it going to do to the economy in your country? What's it going to do to your ability to understand what's happening outside the walls of your country? Those kinds of questions. And we can only do that by sort of being very, put gold on the table. Don't ask for anything in return. Just make that well understood.
So I'm going to ask you to talk about another one of these concepts that you call the dispositive threshold, but I want to give you an example first. So as maybe some of you have, I lived for many years in Hong Kong, and one of the heroes of the Hong Kong economy in the 60s and 70s was a fellow named John Copperthwaite. He was the financial secretary of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a very free marketplace. Milton Friedman, the great free market economist, came to Hong Kong with a complaint to Sir John Copperthwaite. He said, I'm trying to write about the economy of Hong Kong, but you don't keep any data. You don't even keep GDP data. You don't keep employment data. You don't keep any of the data. Why is that? And John Copperthwaite said, well, if I kept the data, somebody would be sorely tempted to use it to try to plan our economy. And it would have the opposite impact of what people thought. So, you know, most countries in the world do keep those data. very few of them grow as fast as Hong Kong. But tell us about this concept of the dispositive threshold and when you have a good answer and when you don't.
So it's a perfect example. I can explain the dispositive threshold. I'm going to give you an example of it first. I was in the UK recently, and I was talking about data science to a group of people, probably about this size room. And the people had, it was in an office setting, so people had cups and bottles and things. And I asked somebody, what are you drinking? And they said, coffee. And I asked someone else, what are you drinking? And it was obviously a bottle of water, and they said water. And I asked 3 or 4 other people, and the answer was either water or coffee, and not one person said tea. And so I said, well, based on this sample, I can reasonably conclude that people in the UK don't like tea. And that's obviously not true. So the dispositive means disposition. You can make a decision. The dispositive threshold is when you have enough data to make a decision. But it's not when you necessarily have enough data to make a good decision. So the trick is that we get into these situations all the time where people say, here, use this data and tell me, what it can tell you. Well, I don't know. What's your question? Can you use this data to prove blah, blah, blah? Well, probably, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is the right data. We have to be very aware of that concept of not just making a decision because we can. We have to assess 2 other universes of data. In your case, very well articulated. The other universe of data is the data that's not there and that you're never going to get, either because it's covert, it's encrypted, it's hidden, nobody is allowed to have it, or in that case, no one's ever collected it. And then the second universe of data is the data that you could go get if you took the time to go get it at the opportunity cost of not having an answer right now. We got to consider those 3 universes.
Right. So there's also the issue of the quantum observed issue. Mm-hmm. So in physics, we all know that a watched item is not the same thing as an unwatched item. Turns out to be true in data also. So
absolutely,
which was not, it's not that clear to me. So try to explain that to this group.
So a quantum is the smallest thing you can talk about. Right? And a quantum observation is observing the smallest thing you can talk about. So in physics, if you observe an electron, the energy that it takes to observe it moves it. So you can know where it was, or you can know where it's going, but you can't really know where it is, right? That happens a lot in data. So if you stick a thermometer in a bowl of soup, you're not measuring the temperature of the soup. You're measuring the temperature of the soup and the thermometer. And we forget that all the time. So if we send out an electronic coupon to a bunch of people and then we watch their behavior to see what they do with the coupon, these are people that know that they received a coupon and that their behavior is being watched. And they will behave differently because they know they're being observed than they would have had you not. But had you not, you wouldn't be able to observe them. So it's this sort of dichotomy of, what do you do in those situations? Also important to understand is that you, the researcher, know that you're observing something. And so your behavior is changed by the fact that you're trying to measure something. And then there's a third set of quantum observation effects, which is we teach things like machine learning algorithms. We teach them to go find things. They're called goal functions, right? Well, those goal functions are informed by our bias. Find the reasons why these guys are committing fraud. Well, wait a minute. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's some new kind of behavior, or maybe it's not illegal where they're doing it, and all of those kinds of things. But when we teach an algorithm to have a certain amount of bias, we're creating a quantum or an observer effect in that algorithm. So it can be the observed, the observer, or the second order, the things that the observed or the observer create, where we can have those effects.
So one of my favorite examples, I think it's a related topic, is what I call the Nigerian email problem. So I don't know, how many of you in the room have ever gotten an email from somebody claiming to be a Nigerian oil magnate?
Everyone raise your hand.
Everybody. So you may not know this. You may not know this, but it turns out that the very best cyber fraudsters use Nigerian emails for lead generation. Here's what happens. They send out emails using the Nigerian email, wherever they're doing it from, Tashkent or wherever it may be. They're not Nigerians, by the way. And they do that because anybody who responds at this point to a Nigerian email is a very likely victim of a scam. So almost all of us will roll our eyes and hit delete and call our IT department and say, it got through the spam filter. But the people who actually respond to the Nigerian email, those people are golden for fraudsters.
So it's like a pre-screen.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So these are fantastic topics. What do you say, though, to a CEO or a CMO or a C-something in a company who says to the data scientist, is what you just told me true?
Well, depending on who they are and whether they can handle the truth, you can be right and dead, right? I think, what I would say as a scientist is, here's why I believe it to be true. So I would build my case based on what I've learned about the thing that I'm studying. There's two kinds of, I don't want to get overly theoretical here, but there's two kinds of discovery. There's positivistic discovery, where the truth was out there and you just went and found it. Like, we know the equation for gravity right now isn't quite right. It's almost right, but it's not quite right, right? When we find the better one, we'll know it because it'll better predict what we observe. That's positivistic, done. Constructivist is when you construct the truth through the research that you're doing. So if I studied racism now, I would conclude something very different than if I studied it in 1960. And so a lot of times when we're having these discussions about, is this true, it's constructivist, right? There is no truth to go out and find. So I really have to explain why I believe this conclusion to be correct to the question we were asking. Mm-hmm. It's not usually true-false. There's shades of gray in there. But if you say, are these people more likely to be victims of fraud than these people, I can tell you why I think the people that have responded to the Nigerian email scam are more permeable than the others. And I can prove it with some observation. So that's why I think this is true. Okay. I probably don't use that many words with the CEO, though.
Maybe your CEO.
Well, ours would actually want to know more.
Yours a big guy. So let's, I want to talk about an area where, unlike maybe some of the areas of business where we're awash in data, there's some areas where I think we don't have nearly the data that maybe we should. And one of those is the area of healthcare, where if we had more data, anonymized data, about who suffers from what, wouldn't we be a lot better off? So there's, as you know, recent use of DNA as one of the sources of data. But there's not a lot of research around families really yet, or things like that. And there's so many privacy laws for understandable reasons that it feels like we don't really have all that much data on something that's actually very important to people. How do we, is it a problem? And if it is, how do we get around it?
I think it's a phenomenon. I don't know if it's a problem yet, because the universe you create when you start sharing all of that information is a different one that might lead us to curing certain diseases. It also might lead us to excluding certain people from healthcare, the future effect, the future cop kind of thing. It might lead us to observer effects where, since I know that you have a genetic predisposition to something, I'm going to conclude zebras instead of horses. It might take me down a different path in terms of a differential diagnosis, and the wrong one, right? So I think if we use information carefully, certainly we could learn more, but there's a cost. And I'm not 100% convinced that the cost isn't worse than the situation we have. I'm not a doctor, I stayed in a Holiday Inn one time, but I think that this is a very big question. Certainly biotechnology, medical related, there's always these, there's two issues in data science, if I can take this back to data science. One is around marginalization, and the other is around asymmetry. And they're kind of cousins of each other. So marginalization is when there's the haves and the have-nots. And so if you look at how the internet was constructed, we built the internet in the United States, right? So there's certain advantages to using the internet from here, not because we did it on purpose, but it just is, right? And so if you're in other parts of the world, you have to get through certain technical challenges just to get on parity, right? That's marginalization. And then asymmetry is when some party has more of something than another, right? So if there's a country that builds its telecommunications infrastructure from scratch because they didn't have one last week, They have a much better telecommunications infrastructure than we do here because it's brand new. So there's an asymmetry there. We're a bigger country. We built the internet. They're a smaller country. They have a better communications infrastructure. The whole trick is to sort of rationalize these asymmetries and try and avoid the intentional marginalization to crush, kill, and destroy. You know, sometimes it's good, but usually it's not.
But are you saying then in the area of healthcare that maybe we're better off with less data?
I'm saying that in some cases it's a Red Queen problem, that you give people more data and they can't see more because they're drowning in data. It's sort of the concept here that we're talking about of drowning in this sea of data. In certain problems, if I could just know more information about people that have a rare disease, it's hard to argue that I wouldn't learn more about that rare disease. Right. But is the problem in the case of cancer research of a particular type of well-understood cancer an absence of information, or we forgot to do the orthogonal thing? I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and he says, you know, depressed people are not Prozac deficient. Like, I have to get to the heart of what it is that is troubling them, and that may or may not be part of the solution. It's the same thing with data. Like, sometimes going and getting more data isn't the next first step. It's maybe asking a different question that's better.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit, because this is always in the news, around barriers to data. And a lot of these barriers are regulatory. The European regulators, beginning in 2018, have something called the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a little bit like the right to be forgotten that you probably are aware of, where in Europe you can ask Google to take stuff out of what had been the World Wide Web, if they agree with you. But this is different. This one gives a right to an explanation.
Yep.
Around how an algorithm is used. So that sounds to me like it's going to create some barriers. I'm not asking you is it a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll ask you that as a follow-up. But how serious a thing is something like that? To require companies using digital data, products and services to be able to always to have to explain how an algorithm is being used.
It's a very big deal. It's a very, very big deal. Our company, and I'm sure all the companies represented in this room, are currently looking at how they respond to this and what do they have to do to their data supply chains and their infrastructures. Provenance is a big deal. You have to know where you got the information. We happen to be pretty big on that already. A lot of organizations have just collected information because it was out there. You know, if you're trying to calculate something that'll give you a better correlative relationship in a regression algorithm to predict the performance of a stock, and you're not selling the data, have a nice day, you know, collect whatever you want. Not anymore, right? So we do have to be, we, the human race, have to be more thoughtful about remembering where we learned things. I don't think that's a bad idea. Having to tell someone how my algorithms work, I worked pretty hard on those algorithms. You know, I write algorithms, right? You know, generally when you talk about algorithms, there's this dismissive wave of the hand that goes along with it. Well, some of those algorithms are, you know, trying to figure out how to drive smart cars right now, and I'm pretty sure that Company A and Company B don't want to share their algorithms with each other because it's intellectual property and it's, you know, it's evolving, and if you understand my algorithm, maybe you can reverse engineer what I don't know about, and you know, that's a scary thing. So I think we have to be very careful about this whole transparency thing. I'm all for it, but with caution.
And I think there's also around data, you know, we've been talking about big data topics. I think some of the regulations anyway respond to consumer concerns about their data. And we do, you know, especially here in Silicon Valley, so much of the earlier stages of the internet really ran on advertising, which was all about highly personalized information about all of us. There is this great truism, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product being sold. Which I think, having spent my life selling a lot of advertising, I'm afraid that is quite true. Do you think that we, as consumers, are going to become more concerned about our data, or have we kind of gotten over a concept of privacy, and we don't really care so much.
I think it depends on the definition of we. So I think you and I, being digital immigrants, probably look at this differently. And I know we don't, actually you and I don't even see it exactly the same way, but people who are born into this age where everything seems to be out there see this differently. So I think it will evolve over time. I also think that just like there's a dispositive threshold, there's a creepy threshold, right? So, you know, people don't want things, thinking things about them that may or may not be true and not knowing how they thought them and on and on and on. So I think that the nature of human beings to get close to that line of creepy and then to respond to it either with legislation or with their behavior or by, you know, with their feet and going somewhere else will act as a natural governor to this. But I think we will also trip over it and do worse things than we should have before that happens.
Yeah. Well, this is also an election year. I don't know if any of you have noticed.
It's hard to notice, but...
Yeah, and in 2008 and definitely in 2012, the use of data by campaigns was remarkable.
Unprecedented.
And I don't even know if...
No pun intended.
Yes, thank you. Unprecedented.
Sorry.
ProPublica, which is an investigative journalism operation in New York, tracked in 2012 an invitation to an Obama fundraiser in New York. And they collected the email invitations from as many people as they could find. And they found at least, my memory is at least a dozen different emails inviting people to the same fundraiser, but stressing different points. Mm-hmm. If the person who was being invited had a child at home, they got a somewhat differently worded message. If they read these magazines but not those magazines, they got a somewhat differently worded message. And politicians themselves can now personalize messages to us. So when Lincoln and Douglas had their debate 100-some years ago, people read it, the whole transcript in their local newspaper or had it read to them, and it was the same message to everybody in the country. When we're online now, we're all getting a quite different message, at least from campaigns that believe in using data, and I've read that one of them maybe doesn't believe in it. We'll see how that goes. But I think the trend is very much toward using data. That kind of creeps me out, that we have people running for national office representing everyone who can use technology to state their positions differently to different audiences. Does that creep you out?
No. I'll tell you why. If I were to talk to you after this event, and I were to talk to somebody else after this event about something that we just talked about, I would say different things. Because I know who you are, at least to the extent that we know each other, and I know what I think you might care about. And if I'm a good speaker, I try to present my point to you in a way that which you can hear it. And if I'm talking to somebody else, I change my message so that they can hear me. Now, if the message was changing, that's a different point. So the way I heard you explain that, stressing different elements of the position, if we cross the line where I think it becomes creepy, is if I say that I'm actually, pro vanilla ice cream to you, and I say that I'm pro French vanilla ice cream to someone else, and I'm pro, Cherry Garcia to a third person, and then I try later to take the point that I'm actually, pro all ice cream, and I was just using examples. Now we're sort of torturing this thing. So I think it's okay if I highlight different elements of what I stand for, and I kind of customize my message. I don't think there's a problem with that, depending on how you learned what to customize. How did you know I had kids, right? Or didn't. But I think it's okay as long as we don't cross the line of using information we shouldn't, or saying two different things and just trying to be all things to all people. That's where I think it becomes a problem.
Okay. So we're reserving time for questions. So think of those, and there's a system here, I think. Maybe you raise your hand. Is that how it goes?
It's not just the system here, it's a
a generally accepted system. So you raise your hand, somebody will come, and that'll be great. But before we get to that, I want to ask you to do something difficult, because there's no such thing as a free dinner.
Right.
Dun & Bradstreet is almost 175 years old. Is that right?
Yes.
So
this year.
This year. So I want you to look forward 175 years from now. Not like 3 years, 18 months, no. 175 years. Tell me how we're going to be using data, what kind of problems we will have solved, and maybe how idiotic we will look back on ourselves today and think, why did we think that?
So the biggest thing to me that we need to get a handle on is unstructured data. More than 85% of the data that we're creating does not have a dictionary. It doesn't have an ontology. If there was a recording of this conversation, there's no way to break that up other than to say it's sound, right? The actual reality is that it's not unstructured data. If I listen when people laugh, and I compared it to a transcript, I could figure out what they were laughing at. If I know the vocal range of men and women, I could estimate the ratio of men to women in the room. There's lots of things I could do if I stop calling it unstructured data. So the first thing we got to do is get rid of this concept of unstructured data and just say data yet to be understood, or something like that. Probably a better term than that. The second thing is, without a doubt, right now we're stuck on the bit, the binary computer. The digital computer is binary. Everything is yes or no. We are on the verge, we are living in the moment where the quantum computer is becoming available. And the difference between a quantum computer and a digital computer is that the qubit, the fundamental unit, is now anything between 0 and 1. So it's a lot closer to the way nature lives. There's shades of gray. I think with quantum computing and the unburdening or the unchaining of unstructured data, we will start to be able to discover a lot of things that are right here in the ether that we can't see because we're stuck on structuring things and putting them into zeros and ones. The other big one that I think we will have solved by then is that translation is way more than just transforming something into another language. So you talked about the Lincoln-Douglas debates and you said if people read them, they knew exactly what was said. They knew the words, but they missed the intonation. They missed the facial expression. They missed the body language, all of that stuff. So they didn't actually get the whole message. Similarly, when we transform things from one language to another, we have to make decisions about what do you do in a language that doesn't have a word for yes or no? What do you do in a language that doesn't have verb tenses? What do you do in a language where talking about the future is considered, blaspheming? And, we have to make allowances for that when we speak, and if you're a linguist, you can do that, but Google Translate doesn't do that. So we will have solved those problems, unstructured data and being chained to the 0 and the 1, and the language ubiquity, the translating everything into English doesn't solve anything. It creates a way worse problem, right? So let people talk the way they talk and understand what they mean. Those are the three biggies that I can come up with and probably be right 175 years from now. Beyond that, I don't know. So I just got the thought from somewhere, I don't know, that maybe I should have a tough question for you. Funny you should ask. So you spend a lot of time, I always say as a scientist, if you want to find out if you're crazy, say what you think out loud and someone will tell you, right? Every week you write what you think, not only out loud, but you write it down and you can't change it from the minute it went out to I don't know how many people, lots and lots of people. There is this problem with the truth that as we learn more, what we thought to be true changes, right? And so if you look 175 years out, how do you think that nature of being a journalist or being an editorial writer, I'm not sure exactly what the right term is, someone who writes down what you think and publishes it, how will that change? Will the text just change itself to your new beliefs, or how will that change?
What a good question. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of something to think about before I answer the core of your question, which is I spent many years as an editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal, and those of you who are of a certain age will remember once upon a time the print Wall Street Journal was like really big. I was the publisher who made it really small, but it was once really big. And if you go back in time, one of the things that you find is that the same sort of feature that you would now see, like an unsigned editorial from the editors or an opinion column, is now about half as long as it used to be. So I write a weekly column now. I wrote one in the late 80s that was sort of the same real estate on a printed page, but it was 30% longer. So, and this is Wall Street Journal, you know, readers who have, I believe, on average, a greater attention span than most people, or at least I would like to think so. But all of our attention spans have contracted, and the form of the argument is different. I would say one of the virtues of being associated with something like the Wall Street Journal is that our opinions don't really change that much. Thanks to the magic of digital technology, I occasionally go back and read journal editorials on topics like free trade and Smoot-Hawley and tariffs and things like that. And the language is completely different. The references are completely different, but the point of view is exactly the same. So I take some comfort that 175 years from now, the Wall Street Journal will still be arguing in favor of free trade and the most open borders that anybody could accept. Whether there's a political party that still has that point of view, one will see. That I cannot predict, even next year. But I think that form of journalistic writing has not changed in its general approach for a very long time, and the positions really don't change that much at all.
I think the question, will there be a dark room problem?
Could it be a dark room problem? Yeah, could be. Could be. That's the biggest risk to a set of opinions. It's a dark room problem. In other words, you have all the people who think like you.
Yeah.
They know all of these topics. They might not want to hear other points of view. Absolutely.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think it's I'm looking in the general direction where I heard the question. It's this dystopian view. It's the 1984. It's the Ministry of Truth, right? We're going to establish within this building what the truth is, and then we're going to publish it, and everyone will know what that truth is. And then when things change, we can redact what we wrote, and no one can ever find any evidence of it having been any different than what we say to be true today. Yeah. That is definitely another view of the future, and we have to be very careful that we don't help create that, in my humble opinion.
We're about to go to questions, but I wanted to just follow up on one thing that you said earlier on language. And I think you said 175 years from now, the answer won't be everybody speaking English. And I just want to push back on that a little bit. None of us, by the way, is going to be here 175 years from now.
This recording might be, unfortunately.
I mean, the singularity may happen, but I won't be. You won't. Yeah. You and I won't be around. Some of the rest of you might be around. So who knows if I'm right or wrong? But I've been on the boards of some companies based outside the U.S., Germany and Japan, that made a conscious decision to use English as their lingua franca. And the English is not always exactly the same as ours. Sometimes it does create, as Winston Churchill, I get an extra $1 every time I mention him.
Mention who?
Winston Churchill. Okay. Thank you. That's $3. Thank you. Winston Churchill once said, as you probably know, that Britain and America are two countries separated by a common language.
Yeah.
So even we, original Anglo speakers, have difficulty. But gee, wouldn't it make it over time so much easier to structure data, to understand one another, to make data efficient if we all spoke
it would
the
make
same
it
language?
Easier to, so by context, I'm not just a data scientist. I've studied computational linguistics.
By the way, this is a personal question because Anthony speaks 8 languages.
7.
Almost 8 languages.
And not all well. I don't know if there will be Esperanto, becomes the language that we all speak. I know that anthropologists have studied isolated civilizations, and they've found that those civilizations have the inability to conceptualize certain things that they don't have words for, like war or whatever. And I know that right now everything is physically dispersed enough that even if I snapped my fingers and made us all speak the same language from birth and think in that language, it would still evolve differently because there are isolated places. So I personally don't think you get away from, at the very least, different usages of the same language. And the problem I've been in, you know, I live my life in those meetings where the meeting is in English, in quotes, and then maybe somebody is interpreting, and you know, it's never even close to perfect, and I've struggled with trying to communicate a complex thought in another language, and I just, either I don't know how to talk about quantum computing, or it just isn't a word for ubiquity or whatever, and here we go. And you wind up becoming an approximation of what you're trying to do. I was in a press conference one time in another country, and I said something about our leadership, and fortunately I spoke the language that the translator was speaking, and the translator said he's very impressed with his boss, and that wasn't what I was talking about. So even though I am very impressed with my boss, that wasn't the point. And so, you know, we can lose something just because that concept of leadership doesn't directly translate. I don't think that ever goes away completely.
There was a time in my life when I lived in Europe, and I occasionally would go on French TV news, and they always team me up with the U.S. ambassador at that time to France. And we both spoke French exactly the same way. We sacrificed pronouns, you know, we'd use le weekend, you know, but we spoke exactly the same French. And one of these I said, why do you have the two of us on so often? And the producer said, oh, we just laugh at your French, it's so fantastic. So it would also, you know, eliminate some entertainment from life if we all spoke English.
I was recently doing something for Les Echos in France, and I started in French, and the person who introduced me said, you know, pendant la présentation, si vous voudriez tweeter, and so during the presentation, if you'd like to, and then I didn't get the verb, tweeter, I didn't know what that meant. And I felt like an idiot. I'm standing on the stage, and I don't know what he said. They might want to tweeter, but I don't know what tweeter means. Is it a good thing or a bad? It was tweet. Right? You know. And then I made it worse by saying, what is that? And he said, well, you know, there's this thing called Twitter. And I'm like, yes, I know.
That's great. So I think we should go to questions in any language that Anthony speaks.
Great discussion. Let's say in maybe a shorter time interval at 10 years, how do you see the division of labor between, say, machines, AI, machine learning, and humans in terms of discovery and decision making?
Oh, that's a great question. I think you should answer.
So I had trouble hearing you, so I'm going to repeat the question in case anyone else did. So reducing the threshold of inference to about 10 years, how do I see the shift in effort between people, analytical people, and machine learning? Is that
the ratio, like, so, you know, like robot scientists will be doing much more of the discovery.
So first of all, you use the word discovery, and I love that. I have a model in my head that I use: discovery, curation, synthesis, fabrication, and delivery. So we go find out new data, right? We curate it, we organize it so that we can use it, or we keep it out because we shouldn't, right? Synthesis is we draw some kind of knowledge from it, and maybe in that synthesis we make more data, so the data begets data. And then we fabricate some kind of an answer into a product or a service, and then we deliver it, right? So in each of those places, we have an opportunity for machine learning, AI. Every time I say AI, I want to use air quotes because, you know, artificial intelligence today is symbiotic intelligence. We teach the algorithm to learn in a certain way, and it continues to learn that way. Without getting overly theoretical, there's two schools of thought here. One is that one, that's the Turing model, that, you know, if the machine reaches the point where it does what I do well enough, I'll believe it's intelligent and behave that way, right? There's another school of thought that says machines can never be truly intelligent because we import them with that intelligence and then we get smarter, right? So they can only be as smart as we were, not as smart as we are. Somebody's going to take me to task on that. Those are approximations of the two schools of thought. The people who believe either one of these things tend to be very, you know, they're zealots, right? What I think happens in 10 years, and it's 10 years in internet speed is a lot of time, is that these machine learning algorithms, and there's cognitive computing, and there's sort of cousins of this, will start to do a lot more of the mundane stuff that we do today. So if I'm trying to find more data about the economic situation in Burkina Faso, I got to go hunt around for it. If I can just tell some recursive learning algorithm to go figure that out with about that much information in English, or my language of choice, it would be nice if it just went away and did that, much better than a web search, right? Because all the data is not on the internet. At the same time, we've got whole new areas to think about, like the Internet of Things and quantum computing, where we're not going to have any machine learning. So what I think it does is I think it frees up the really smart people to go worry about bigger problems, and it lets the AI do the stuff we already know how to do better. I don't think it's a bad thing, as long as we understand that there's nothing intelligent about that intelligence. There's something very repetitive, and it might discover things that we wouldn't have found because they can go faster, but we can still think harder. And so we should go think about bigger problems. I said this to somebody before the thing tonight. There's an old joke that when you're camping, if a bear comes into the camp, you don't have to outrun the bear, you have to outrun the other campers, right? So this is about outrunning the other campers. Let's go solve some new problem together. Let's make new mistakes. Is that fair? Did you have a different view on this? Or?
No, that's good. Next question.
There was only one question. Oh.
So it's related to a little bit, so let's think about future of work, right? Because with AI coming in, machine becoming more important, there is a divide in the society which is now getting formed, and all of us as custodians, leaders, whatever you want to call, do we have a responsibility, or should we just keep marching ahead and do the best that we can, and then if the other people in the camp get left behind and eaten by the bear, then so be it, right? And Mr. Trump will completely disagree with that, because he's now essentially winning on a theme that, look, I'll get all of you back into this whole new technology curve, and everybody will have a job, and we'll all ride into the sunset to utopia, right? So
yeah.
How should we all, as leaders in the Valley, how should we think about this, right? Because, whether we like it or not, at some point, everybody in this room, there is a responsibility that we carry, right? So should we let this machine march continue, or should we pause?
So let me give a 50,000-foot answer, and then Anthony, you can come down a little bit if you like. My family and I recently saw Hamilton, the musical. And one of my kids was reading Hamilton, and we got to talking about what people did in this country at the time of the founding. And he went off, and he had to do the search himself, but he found that 98% of people living in the 13 colonies lived and worked on farms. By the way, including John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. But they, of course, were also extremely well educated, and were at the 1% of the 1% of the 1% of the people who lived here. In 1900, 90% of Americans lived and worked on farms. So, I think the obligation of people who are innovators and are causing disruption is to cause as much disruption as possible. We're better off not living and working on farms, even though it meant enormous changes to the educational system. We've fallen behind in those changes. We're failing many people. But the answer to that can't be to slow down innovation. It has to be to push ahead with the innovation and figure out and do a better job of making the transition, which we've made many times before. It's not a new problem, it's just a different version of a very old problem.
So I'm going to sort of build on that. I don't know if I'm going to take it down to another level. There's a number of articles written recently, and actually a number of studies on, depending on what you do, what's your likelihood of eventually taking some level of instruction from a robot. And if you're a lawyer, or you're an airline pilot, or you're a surgeon, you have a different percentage of likelihood, right? And the reality is that most job functions have a higher propensity to, at some point, take some degree of instruction from a robot. Does that mean a robot will tell you everything to do? No, it doesn't. But I sure would love a robot that tells me the more important emails to focus on, right? Instead of what I do today, which is try not to die, right? So we have to be careful what we wish for. I think that this concept of innovation even that means different things to different people. So usually we take innovation to mean creating something new that we can sell, or some new way of doing something, and those are certainly forms of innovation. Taking a very big problem and breaking it down into smaller problems that we still haven't solved is another kind of innovation. And discovering that we have a problem that we didn't know we had, that's another kind of innovation. So I think that our responsibility as human beings, and not human doings, is to let the machines do what machines do well, and remember that that does not unburden us from the responsibility of thinking about what we should be doing with all the free time that it created. I have a personal philosophy, this is going to sound really sappy, but I swear I mean it, that we should teach something and learn something every day. I think if we behave that way, we do much better than if we just wait until the political system or the technology infrastructure or the medical community or the whatever solves all my problems for me, because that's never going to happen.
Bikash Chatterjee from M&E Tech. You talked briefly about the need for data transparency in healthcare and the potential portent of what that could do. In June of 2013, the European Union passed a law that said they would mandate all pharma companies to make their clinical data available. I think only 9% of all their clinical data is actually available, with the hope of allowing physicians, et cetera, to glean insights into potentially curing diseases. Raises all sorts of IP issues, et cetera, associated around that. And all sorts of crazy solutions came out of that. I think the European Union Pharmaceutical Association said, oh, don't worry, we will self-regulate and we will make sure the data you get is the data you need. And then other folks say, well, no, we're going to create a separate independent entity which has no vested interest in that data, and they will vet and control and distribute that data. I guess from my perspective, I'm wondering, as you're looking at the emergence of big data here, is there a social component, a social responsibility component of that that needs to be part of your plan when you start looking at your algorithms and data analysis components? And if so, what are the possible ramifications around how you might control that? The concept of an independent entity, self-policing, holistic, universal, I don't know, kumbaya thing that we sign. I'm just curious, because that certainly is the direction we're going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I were making a prediction about 175 years from now, we would look back on people today and say how crazy we were that we didn't have aggressive sharing of medical information. That at that point it will be viewed as a bizarre behavior not to share data that could help your descendants. And looking at it a different way, if we had a terrific amount of data from 5 generations ago, all of us would behave differently. We'd understand ourselves differently. So I don't know how you get from where we are now to that outcome. I don't know what regulations are. I don't know what market forces there are. And I don't know how we get over the privacy issue that is real and understandable. I'm just, the amount of value that could come from that kind of data, I think looking back when we've solved it, people will say what idiots we were that we didn't solve it faster.
If I can just add to that, so you're asking a really interesting question about public policy in data. If I can just take it up away from medical, because I could say the same thing about the airline industry and safety, and I could say the same thing about exoplanets and, you know, wherever you want to go with it. Evolution, technology will always be in front of regulation. Regulation sometimes tries to predict certain technologies and regulate it in advance. It usually completely fails because the people evolving those technologies understand the regulation and then they change what they create. And it's like this, you know, chicken and egg thing. Our behavior, embedded in your question was, is there a moral imperative to behave differently around the way we produce and consume data? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. You don't just do something because the regulation says you can do it or you can't do it. There should always be a difference between what you can do and what you should do and what you will do. And I think if organizations don't have that conscious decision to make a conscious evidence-based decision that, yeah, we can do this, but we're not going to, then I don't want to say we're all doomed, but it's going to be a much rockier road. There's a thing right now between open data and proprietary data. And the open data people are all about, everything should be open and free. And, I think to a certain extent that's true, but not to the absolute extent. I accept that I can go into a drugstore and buy aspirin, but I need a prescription and a pharmacist to give me certain drugs because I'm an idiot. I may not know that if I take this drug with this drug, something bad will happen, right? And I look at that system to protect me from my own ignorance. And data is the same way, that you can use data, hemlines and stock prices. You can draw conclusions that make absolutely no sense. You don't understand the math. You're trying to use the wrong, there's the assumptions behind the model that you've used don't fit the situation that you're in. And we made it really easy because we put this cool interface on it. And all you have to do is press the green button. Well, that didn't mean that you should press the green button. So there's always, I think, going to be an element of malpractice in the way we use data, and I do not think regulation will save us from our own stupidity. We have to save ourselves too.
I think we have time for another question.
Sorry, I'm sorry. There's a right bias to this.
But 2 questions.
We have 2 questions. We can see over here better than
Hi. So actually, I think
it's a question from God.
Ah, there we are. I'm sorry.
it's a corollary, I guess, to what you just talked about, because I was going to ask about the open data. Obviously, there's a movement towards open data, yet I don't think everybody in this room would like their social security numbers
There
to
you
become open data. But as we get into a world where we have massive amounts of data coming out at real time, are you aware of any kind of technical work or such to kind of put that consciousness into the stream to be able to tell at what point certain data should become open?
Do you want to?
No.
So your question is, should there be open metadata?
Well, no. Well, is there a way of actually technical work at actually putting in kind of ways into the data infrastructure to be able to determine at what point what sort of data should become open?
There's going to need to be a lot more. So the place where I think you'll see that kind of technology emerge first is probably the Internet of Things. We have enough trouble with the Internet of Internet right now, trying to get everything to talk to everything. And now we're creating all these devices that create all kinds of data, and we haven't foreseen all the types of malfeasance and stupidity that can come out of allowing that data to be produced. And I can tell you stories, after we break, I can tell you stories about, people sitting in parking lots and re-engineering manufacturing processes from IoT devices and, devices that should be able to discover each other, discovering the wrong device and doing the wrong thing. So I think that, that's probably the first place where there'll be some sort of registry of intent. Look, I'm a microphone, and I am intended to produce sound and not unbelievably loud thumping sounds, and therefore, that kind of thing, that there'll be, hypothetically, that there'll be some sort of governance built into microphones in general, and when a microphone is discovered, we'll know that sound above a certain level of decibels shouldn't
Somebody
be
in this audience has just patented that idea.
There you go. And it's about that easy, right? But yeah, so I think if you look at the IoT, that's probably the first place where you'll see that. If you look at Bluetooth as an analog of the IoT, it took about 10 years for that technology to catch on because they kind of forgot to think about it. And then people, they're rushing to build Bluetooth devices. Well, here's a headset that can talk to a phone. Well, how do I know it doesn't discover his phone? Oh, we'll put a password in. How are you going to remember the password? Well, we'll make it 1111. Well, it's not a password, right? We got to do better than that.
You're not supposed to disclose my password on the stage, Anthony.
There you go. Mine is star, 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 star. We got to do better than that. We got to be better than the mistakes we made yesterday. We have to make new mistakes.
I'm getting the Churchillian.
The gentleman over here
Sign.
has been dissed completely. I'm sorry.
Quick, please.
Don't tap on that
So
microphone.
Anthony, this is for you. This is a data geek question.
Yes.
So my question is less about big data, but more about what are your perspectives on, I work across a lot of different companies, and so many companies that I come into, I see a disconnect of enterprise data across cross-functional departments. Such a basic thing, right? And there are some companies that I deal with that, for example, have a chief data officer in place that helps surmise and bring together people. What's your perspectives on why that isn't more commonplace? Is it a control thing, or what is? I want to get your
So the way organizations are set up right now, that's a great question. You know, we have enough trouble with the with the data that's already within the four walls of our enterprise that we're not sharing, and we're worrying about open data and all this other stuff, right? Part of it is the way organizations are set up. You know, the sales guys and the engineering guys and the legal guys only try to tell each other what they think the other parties need to know because they have their goals and they want to move on. And I don't think there's nastiness in this. Look, I just don't have time to explain it all to you. You know, here's what you need to know. How do you know what I need to know? So this concept of having silos of data, we have addressed it. You know, ERPs were supposed to solve this problem. We'll take all the enterprise data and we'll put it in one place and everybody will use it seamlessly. And then there's all these systems that don't get migrated into the ERP. What about the engineering drawings? Well, we'll build an interface. You just created another silo of data, right? So I think we'll get much better at that with data lakes and with some of the technology that exists to allow sort of more. The ETL problem is going away. I'm sorry for all the people that you made me into a geek here, but extract, transform, and load. So being able to change the format of something to use it somewhere else, those kinds of problems will slowly disappear. There'll be more easy languages for describing what's in data, metadata description languages. So it'll be a lot easier to take this thing over here and this thing over here and just sort of blend them together. I think what we still are never going to get past is the fact that organizations sometimes intentionally set people up with different goals that are at odds with each other. This healthy tension that exists in organizations on purpose creates a natural governing effect that prevents us from doing colossally stupid things. And we can, in the internet age, we can make mistakes much faster than we used to.
Smarter things if the data
that are synergized, right? Yeah. So it's not entirely going to go away, but I think the nature of silos is going to change. The only silos that will remain are the ones that we intentionally put there. Let's put it that way. Is that fair? Okay. Sorry. I'm going to stick around after the event. So. Yeah.
Yes, actually, we have to let. Okay, Gordon, do you mind being late for your plane?
I will have a short answer.
Okay.
Short answer.
Okay. Sorry. Thanks so much. This is Carmen with CD Networks. Thanks so much. Great presentation, by the way. The dark room matter problem. Too many experts in the room. I read Rise of the Creative Class by Richard Florida.
Yep.
And he speaks to that to some extent in that book.
I've spoken to Richard Florida about it.
Oh, excellent. There you go. My question to you is, to what extent do you let in other opinions outside of the experts? How do you balance that out?
So the experts in the room would say, we'll tell them when they have an opinion that's valid. Right? I think that it's partly about understanding and observing the system and measuring when those experts are failing to solve the problems that they're supposed to solve. That's the very short answer. I'll give you a much longer one later.
Sure.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I think everybody in this room found that to be a very valuable discussion, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts so generously with us. We really appreciate it. As a very small token of our appreciation, we have for you the Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
Thank you. Thank you. Right.
And a recording of this program will be available on the Churchill Club YouTube channel shortly. We hope that you'll find that to be a valuable resource, as well as for the other programs that we have posted there as well. And our next program is going to be on July 7th with Akamai CEO Tom Layton and the legendary Jeffrey Moore. Hope you'll join us for that. Gordon has to dash because he has to catch a plane now, but Anthony has generously agreed to stick around and talk with you if you'd like to talk with him after the program. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.